Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammed Tarakoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to the Institute's lecture series today, featuring Aqsa Ijaz, who is speaking on fiction and formation of romantic love, the afterlife of Nizami Ganjavi's Khusru Shīrīn. We are grateful to the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute and the Encyclopedia Iranica Foundation for co-sponsoring the Elahé Mir-Djalali lecture series today. At the outset, I'd like to express our solidarity with the inspiring women's movement in Iran and our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. I welcome Aqsa Ijaz to the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies. Ijaz works on classical Persian poetry and studies its reception in medieval and early modern North India. Born and raised in Lahore, Pakistan, she's trained in Indian classical music and specializes on the vocal forms of Thumari and Ghazal. As a scholar of Persian, Urdu, and Punjabi, Aqsa's doctoral research focuses on the reception of the 12th century Persian poet Nizami Ganjavi and examines the formative role Nizami's poetry played in shaping the language of love in pre-modern North India. Besides her scholarly work, Aqsa is an essayist and a translator and writer for various international publications, such as the World Literature Today, the Herald, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Aqsa is committed to sharing academic research with audiences across the globe, and in this regard, she serves on the editorial board of the Marginalia Review of Books in Los Angeles. Currently, she teaches Urdu at the Department of Language Studies and is the co-manager of the Global Past Research Initiative at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Aqsa Ijaz, very welcome.
I'm very privileged to be here, and I'm very grateful for the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute for providing me this opportunity to speak with you all. Thank you, all of you who are here in person with us, and thank you everybody who's joining us from Zoom. My talk today is a variation on the topic of my dissertation, which is Shaping the Language of Love, the Afterlife of Nizami Ganjavi's Khusru Shīrīn in Hindustan, in which I studied Nizami's reception, especially the reception of his poem Khusru Shīrīn in pre-modern North India. And of course, as you know, in the course of the dissertation, one has to go through the thick forest of various details, all of which I might not be able to reproduce here. But I am going to try and be as comprehensive in this talk as possible and hopefully address many of the questions and your comments in the Q&A session. So I hope you will forgive any gaps in my narrativity and be patient till we get to the Q&A session. As one travels down the winding coastal highway of Makran, with the Arabian Sea like a grand symphony in the background resonating through Pakistan and Iran, One is introduced to a mysterious gravesite nestled among peaks that seem to mirror the deserted landscape described in Nizami's account of Farhad's desert journey. As you can see from this photograph, the rugged and intimidating red rocks provide a stark contrast to the serene and pristine whitewashed shrine sovereignly situated in the middle of nowhere. This shrine is believed to be the final resting place of the legendary couple Shīrīn and Farhad, and its location in the middle of nowhere only adds to its mystical charm. The red mountains surrounding the whitewashed shrine with their barren and rugged appearance evoke the feeling of spiritual alienation in the viewer while simultaneously provoking a strange sense of wonder. One can't help but question the existence of this very unlikely shrine in the middle of this spectral land of longing. With this shrine in the middle of these giant rocks, the place often feels almost paradoxically as if filled with strange sense of hope and purpose. Ever since I witnessed this strange monument in Laspela, Balochistan, which is in modern-day Pakistan, I wondered about how Nizami's poem Khusrau Shīrīn was received and read beyond the poem's courtly reception. Why it varied so much in its vernacular retellings in North India, and more importantly, why it thrived the way it did for almost a millennium in various parts of the Indian subcontinent. As you can see, the poem, according to the plot embodied in this gravesite, has a very different ending than what we see in Nizami's 12th century Persian poem. Those of you who know the poem remember that the subplot featuring Shīrīn and Farhad ends abruptly and rather tragically when King Khusrau finds out about Farhad's increasing devotion to Shīrīn and tricks him into killing himself when he's told that Shīrīn is dead. Throughout the various courtly retellings of the poem, starting with Amir Khusrau's trend-setting jawab, his response in the late 13th century, some version or the other of this dissonant episode has remained part of the main plot that features the somewhat happy and yet tragic love story of the last son in King Khusrau Parvez II and the Armenian princess we all know as Shīrīn. That's where she kills herself on the dead body of Khusrau, who's killed by his son, Shīrīn. However, it is in the non-courtly retellings, as you see in the oral and material cultural retelling of the poem, that we see Farhad's character resurface as the protagonist of the poem and take the center stage in the narrative action. While Nizami's classic tragedy is well known and resonates widely, the story of Farhad and Shīrīn takes on a different meaning in various North Indian retellings. In these versions, Farhad and Shīrīn are united in death, rather than remaining violently separated as in Nizami's poem. This is the inside, this is the epitaph on the grave inside that shrine that I just showed you, and it's written in 3 vernacular languages like Saraiki, Sindhi, Punjabi, and of course there is Arabic on the top where you see the Quranic verses being inscribed. This seemingly small change in the narrative structure of the poem, in my view, is an instance of the transtemporal dialogue on the nature of love and separation, which Nizami's poem deliberately introduces through Farhad's character, but leaves it open as a suggestive possibility. In Nizami's Khusrau Shīrīn, Farhad's death prefigures the end of a love that Shīrīn evokes in his soul through the sound of her laughter. Here it's this very beautiful scene where we are told how Farhad falls in love with Shīrīn. It's not her face, it's not the words, the logos which she's famous for, but just her laughter, just her voice. Unlike the love she inspires in King Khusrau through her refined and clever speech. In the verses of the 18th century Punjabi poet Hashim Shah, Farhad's death marks the beginning of love that persists even after Farhad's death, leading to a journey into the underworld of the dead. Here I would like to read a few verses from the Punjabi retelling in which Hashim Shah depicts an awe-inspiring scene of the lover's burial rite. I think I'll skip the Punjabi original and go straight to the translation in order to have a smooth progression of the whole talk. I quote, They were surrounded by the paradisial fairies on all four sides, and their passion burned everyone who came to bury them. Their faces were as if painted by destiny itself. With love, the eternal painter had written their portraits well. The Houris came along with Prince Farhad, dressed up in their finest jewels. And from there, then the wanderer left his resting place. The garden became horrifying and the palace turned somber. When we heard the trees lament, we even heard the trees lament the departure of these lovers. In these mourning garden, they buried the silver body of Shīrīn and laid the corpse of the mountain breaker on the bank of the canal. The princess' floor was now made of dust, and her face was illuminated by the pain of separation. But very soon they found her coffin to be empty, and her father found it disturbing. It's another interesting fact that only in the North Indian retellings, Shīrīn has a father. We don't see her having a father anywhere in the Persian tradition. Many men of wisdom congregated to figure out this mystery and struggled with multiple explanations, but knew not of the wisdom behind the veil. There was one visionary among them who asked, "Go and see the grave of the crazed one, if he's there or not." Upon hearing this, the emperor ordered to do as he was told and decided to look at what was the glory of divine wisdom. Although the grave of the crazed one was cemented with stone, they had to go once more and dig it all over again. They covered the grave with the veil around and dispersed people away. And as soon as they dug it, they found the secret of the lore. They smelled a heavenly perfume coming out of this glorious miracle and saw the grave illuminated with 1,000 lamps burning in it. The lover and the beloved were both seen together. With great truth and divine support, lovers were united, end quote. And in this particular slide, you can see how the poet himself addresses himself. He addresses himself and says, God, Hashim, use your mind and tell a believable story. How can it be that these people are together in death and they're able to see it? Upon entering the shrine of Shīrīn and Farhad in Las Bela, one is struck by an unexpected revelation that Shīrīn and Farhad are believed to be buried together in a single grave. As we see in Hashim Shah's concluding verses, the poem tells us that while Shīrīn and Farhad lived their lives in the experience of each other's absence, they died with the desire to be united in death. But this union in death, unlike the traditional narrative of disembodied spiritual union between lovers who could not be together in life and ended up taking their own lives, is deliberately portrayed with the graphic descriptions of their bodies coming together to be buried in one grave. In his conclusion of the story, Hashim Shah remarkably inverts Nizami's treatment of Farhad and Shīrīn's episode and engages with Nizami's perspectival openness with the virtuosic enmeshing of Islamic eschatological belief in the afterlife and the wonder-evoking poetics of the Ajaib tradition. On one of my earlier trips to the site, I found out that visitors to the shrine not only come to pay their respects and pray for union with their desired beloveds, they also believe the act of coming together in death, as embodied by Shīrīn and Farhad, as a transformative miracle in Las Bela's sacred geography. The location of this gravesite, in a region where the number of reported honor killings exceeds the rest of the country, is ironic in its moral embrace of the poem through this unorthodox practice. However, to me, this intriguing contrast continues to add to the significance of this site as part of Nizami's reception in North India. As a literary scholar interested in the North Indian reception of Nizami's poem, this shrine not only offers a unique opportunity for immersive ethnographic research to investigate how fictional narratives inform and shape the various experiences of emotion, it also raises important questions about the study of emotions in various historical contexts. Can emotions have history? And if so, where can we find their archives? Can this shrine, like the various textual and visual retellings of Nizami's poem, be considered as part of the archives in studying the history of love in the Persianate world? Can these material archives serve as a point of reference in understanding the history of emotions as they intersect with literary history on the one hand and oral memory on the other? This shrine and its significance in the cultural and literary context provides an interesting point of reference to explore these questions further. For a long time, studies in emotions and affect have tried to overcome the dichotomy between emotions as a phenomenon taking place inside the subjects and the external world in which they move. In doing so, scholars in the field of history of emotions have tried to emphasize the study of emotions not only as a psychosomatic phenomenon taking place inside individuals as such, but in the relationship between them and the world. Emotions in this sense are no longer conceived inside neatly charted and bounded subjects. Rather, they are in the space of in-between, in the subject's interactions with the world that informs and shapes emotions as a vicariously inhabited and intersubjectively negotiated phenomenon. As a scholar who's interested in engaging the question of love vis-a-vis the temporality of the past from the vantage point of my own present, I find myself fascinated by the challenge that exploring this relational dimension between subjects and the world poses to me. The question for me is not only to explore the experience of love in a particular historical and cultural era, but also to question my own reach of the time in which certain articulations of emotions take place. As Margaret Penau in her recent book entitled Emotions and Temporality suggests, past, present, and future co-constitute each other to the degree of embroiling not only the linear conception of time, but also the possibility of sharp distinction between times. Because the past and the future are not safely gone or yet to come, they haunt the present with their all-pervasive presence. And as if this was not confusing enough, I have T.S. Eliot for you. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future and time future contained in time past. How can you imagine such a diffuse phenomenon of time as interconnected temporalities constantly spilling into each other? Where do we locate the archives of its experience, and how does the human mind process this reflexive directionality of time? While quantum physicists have done some incredible work to show us that time has no unity or directionality in itself, and it is only the human perception that gives any meaning to it, for me, there is no better way to engage this experience historically than to converse with the poet who turns this nihilistic dread of the cosmos into the materiality of the poem and gives us an archive to study not only the experience of time through ages, but also the dialogue among the dead for us to overhear. It is like what the Argentine storyteller Borges called the Elahé, a point in space that contains all other points. Anyone who gazes into it can see everything in time from every angle simultaneously. Put simply, it is in the form of the poem and its continued reception where I find my archives to study the history of love in experience of its historical readers. I argue that any historical experience of emotion is mediated as well as modulated by the fascinating interaction between imagination, which I understand as a faculty of creating images or forms, and the imaginary, which links such imagery with affect and emotion that captures the significance the world carries for us. As a literary scholar, I differ here from historians who believe the imaginary to be the opposite of the real. The vexed question of who believe the imaginary to be the opposite of the real. Instead, I propose to see imagination and the imaginary artifact as faculties through which the world is made real to us. The vexed question of how we perceive the world and what mediates this perception is at the center of my argument. By examining the imaginary through poetic forms, we can gain a direct understanding of the past's views on love, for poetry is the only medium in which where language creates the very reality it purports to express. And this is one of my favorite couplets from Nizami's Mahsanul Asrar. Gives you that in a nutshell. در لغت عشق سخن جان ماست ما سخنیم in talal ایوان ماست. Interesting how he frames words as ruins, and these are the ruins that we inhabit as our houses, as our palaces. The images and poetic principles that a poet employs to engage his readers make the poem a vehicle through which we learn to not only think, but also feel our way around what it means to be in love in different temporal and historical contexts. Be that as it may, to my knowledge, there is no other poet in the Perso-Islamic tradition who emphasizes this inextricable relationship between logos and eros, sukhan or ishq, than the Persian poet Nizami of Ganjavi. Writing at the height of Islamic philosophical discourse on the question of love during the reign of the Seljuk dynasty in what is modern-day Azerbaijan, Nizami invoked fictionality as an epistemological intervention and presented it as a superior mode, or perhaps a better mode of addressing the question of love that was hitherto discussed mostly in peripatetic philosophy and theological texts. In making his poem the site of thinking about love, where reality and imagination become the two edges of the poem's capacity to represent, Nizami in his Khusrau Shīrīn radically challenges the solipsistic speculations of philosophy and presents love as a phenomenon unfolding in the embodied human intersubjectivity. In doing this, Nizami implicitly questions the self-centered understanding of love proposed by Avicenna and Al-Ghazali, who see love as directed toward God or as a self-actualization of all beings. In Avicenna and Al-Ghazali's speculation, the object of love is often non-responsive, which is convenient as it is silent and does not disrupt the subject's perpetual self-referentiality. Taking fiction as a distinct mode of approaching the question of love, Nizami suggests through the poem's open poetics, the idea of perspectivism, through which he brings the minor characters, such as Farhad, to the fore, and interrupts the main plot to create a superficial dissonance in order to make a larger point about how we know love in the embodied realm of human experience and alterity. As I argue in my doctoral dissertation, it is because of the poem's epistemological intervention in how we address the question of love and what role poetic narratives play in ensuring that knowledge, that poem has had a defining impact on the literary and cultural imagination of the Persianate world, especially North India. In North India alone, Nizami's impact crosses boundaries of language, religion, and culture. To speak only of the impact of the poem that interests me in my work, its resonance continues to this day. Between medieval, early modern, and colonial period, several poets writing in Urdu, Punjabi, Sindhi, and other North Indian vernaculars translated and retold Nizami's poem to address the changing modes of articulating the experience of love. Well-known painters commissioned by major imperial courts throughout the pre-modern period visually interpreted the poem's key scenes in lavish illustrations. Street bards and storytellers writing in Urdu and Punjabi appropriated it into their repertoire of performative storytelling. And non-literate audiences, as you saw in the oral reception of the poem, marked their affinities with Nizami's poem by appropriating its characters into the very soil of the land. With an intent of a literary historian interested in documenting this fabulous journey of Nizami's poem in North India, I approached Nizami's Khusrau Shīrīn as an event in the literary history of the Persianate world, which in my view not only gave a new meaning to the genre of Ishqiya Masnavi, but also challenged the epistemological frameworks in which the question of love in human experience was thought about. If we put Nizami's Khusrau Shīrīn in conversation or in the context of the larger world of the medieval Islamic thought, we notice that unlike his predecessors in peripatetic philosophy and theosophical mysticism, Nizami is not interested in defining what love is. With his logic of apophatic speech that speaks of love in terms of what it is not, it is clear that Nizami implicitly critiques the hopeless solipsism of defining love in abstract modes of philosophical speculation, which more often than not borders on narcissistic self-referentiality of a normatively privileged male thinker, addressing in abstraction what can only be understood in embodied experience. Instead, for Nizami in Khusrau Shīrīn, the more productive question has an epistemological significance. His self-conscious invocation of the poem's inherent fictionality in his discourse on love is at the heart of the affective dimension he seeks to explore in his poem. In this regard, the poem as an artifact of imagination is proposed as a mode of knowing, which through its power of simultaneous integration of multiple superficially dissonant aspects and perspectives allows us to grasp what abstract philosophy only summarily encompasses. Through constellating details, ambiguities, dissonances, and placing various facets of the larger shape of desire before the reader's mind, in Khusru Shīrīn, Nizami goes beyond the need to define love and shows through what I call his poetics of openness, a vast spectrum of human experience whose baffling diversity and embodied messiness of dealing with the other is more yielding to a historian of emotion than pinning the ontological question to an answer. In this regard, Nizami does not cheapen the overwhelming power of emotion by pinning it to a definition, which by definition would be very limited. He shifts the focus from the ontological question of love to its epistemological dimension, suggesting that by exploring the materiality of poetry, ambiguity, and different perspectives, we can gain a deeper understanding of love. This approach assumes the validity of the other's voice and challenges the subject's own, potentially self-centered definitions of love. Over the course of my doctoral dissertation, I show in greater detail how Nizami's poetics of openness actively elicit his North Indian readers in joining the chorus on the question of love, which he deliberately leaves open as if it were a kind of debate. The meta-narrative poetics of showing the experience of love and desire through multiply unresolved perspectives and the Munazara-like tenor of his narrativity presents the poem as a kind of a question. As you briefly saw in Hashim Shah's concluding verses of his response to Nizami's poem, later poets engaged various aspects of Nizami's poem, the chief among which was completing the suggestively open spaces in his text. I would love to go deeper into the various reading journeys the poem has taken through medieval Delhi to early modern Punjab and British India, and show you the multiple ways in which Nizami's readers have responded to him across time and space. However, due to limited amount of time, I think it would be better for me to dwell a bit more on Nizami's exploration of love and desire in relation to the power of the artifact. Therefore, in the remaining time that I have left, I would like to briefly summarize the poem for those of you who are not familiar with it, and then follow up with a concentrated reading of a fascinating episode in the poem where Nizami illuminates the relationship of desire with the mimetic force of the imaginary artifact. Written approximately in 1180 and 1181 AD, Nizami's Khusru Shīrīn is a sprawling poem exploring the question of love over 6,500 couplets featuring the last Sasanian king Khusru Parvez II and the Armenian princess Shīrīn. Inherited from his predecessor Abul Qasim Firdausi, in whose Shahnameh we see the first appearance of the story, featuring it as an episode in the scope of the larger epic of Persian history. Nizami picks up the episode from pre-Islamic Persia, representing the moment heralding the twilight of the last Persian dynasty before the advent of Islam, and reimagines it as a full-fledged narrative romance, filling the gaps in the historical narrative. In this sense, as opposed to some medieval scholars' assertion, Khusru Shīrīn is not a romance in the sentimental sense of the word. Instead, it's a twofold attempt to reimagine history with an intent to understand its character deeply and to propose fiction as a more expansive mode of understanding the idea of love than abstract theories of speculative nature. In this sense, Nizami's invocation of fictionality in Khusru Shīrīn is not to engage in the crooked speech or kashgui, his word, for its own sake, but to use the capacity of poetic language, its inherent capacity to embody ambiguities, dissonant perspectives, and indeterminacy to enable the experience of emotion in ways that philosophy and other discursive modes of thinking do not. While the primary plot features Khusru Shīrīn as the dominant stratum of exploring love as a phenomenon embodied in human intersubjectivity, Nizami's poem pushes the stakes further and complicates the poem's investment in the epistemological principle of perspectivism, to argue that love is anything but a solipsistic abstraction. As much as we can see the poem arguing something, because a poem by definition should not have a final conclusion or final thought. As the turbulent story between the unruly King Khusrau and the beautiful Shīrīn unfolds, we as readers are constantly kept on our toes. As soon as we get comfortable in what the narrator shows us by way of how love operates between the spoiled king and the headstrong Shīrīn, our expectations are thwarted with some other twist that triangulates what we think we understand so far. Here I must note that Nizami assumes a deep and intense attention on the part of his reader and expects us to pause and ponder before being ready to name the unnameable. In this sense, he uses ambiguity and principles of indeterminacy for their mimetic function. That is, he complicates the plot and the lives of primary characters by introducing other and often marginal perspectives, contradicting or even expanding the primary ones. If there is a geometrical shape that could inform our visual understanding of Nizami's poem, I think it has to be that of the concentric circles. While the story has one central point of reference, that is the plot unfolding between Khusru and Shīrīn, its larger concern with the question of love keeps expanding its radar to other perspectives that complicate the primary plot's resolution. We think we are reading a story of two royal characters experiencing the throes of desire for the first time, but suddenly the plot is interrupted by introducing a character from a non-courtly setting, such as Farhad and his unlikely devotion for the princess, who desire her much more passionately and sincerely than the king himself. It becomes a competitive rivalry, or introducing Farhad's character becomes a competitive rivalry between the powerful king and the artisanal servant. The love story of the two royal characters is interrupted by the poet quite deliberately, I argue, to make us pause and think. And indeed, this intended pause fires up many of Nizami's North Indian readers, who write long and passionate responses to this interruption in later periods of the poem's reception history. The multidimensional perspectivism in Nizami's poem is one reason why one finds it so hard to summarize the plot of the poem in its entirety, because there is not one plot, and even if there is, it is not very meaningful unless it is read in relation to Nizami's overall poetics of the poem, which is largely invested in opening new perspectives in addressing the question of love. The poetics of the poem in Khusrau Shīrīn is to know how is invested in knowing how we know what we know about love and how its knowledge is made possible. As I mentioned earlier, for Nizami, this knowledge is embodied in the form of the imaginary, for which sometimes he uses poetry and sometimes painting and even music. Those of you who know the poem, you have Elahé Barbad, and you have Nagisa's dance and her harps, and then you have poetry and painting all coming together and creating that perception as a whole. Here I will pause my commentary for a moment and read you a beautifully narrated scene in which Nizami shows us one of his perspectivist takes on how the seed of romantic desire is planted in one's heart and what kind of knowledge it makes possible. The following scene takes place when Khusrau's boon companion Shapur is tasked with making Shīrīn fall in love with the king. We all remember that episode, right? All the way from Madain to Armenia, Shapur arrives with the divine task of generating desire where it doesn't exist. I'm just going to read my translation of the Persian passage because it's just too long. I quote, "In the ancient cloister of Armenia, the wise Shapur rested, for his journey here was long and debilitating. Truth he wanted from the elderly of that cloister, Armenia, who were aware of the workings of the sky's old wheel. It was the wise old men who informed him about the pleasure ground of those region dwellers." That's reference to Shīrīn and her companions. They say, "At the end of the rocky mountain, there's a meadow tightly encircled by a forest. At dawn, those intoxicated cypresses will come to the musky meadows. When the world grew squirrel gray and stewed rents, the weasel of the night hid from the ermine of the day. The sun's disk rose up from Alborz, renewing the custom of Jamshed for the world. Earlier at dawn, then those pleasure-loving idols came. The dawn-rising Shapur girded himself. He made a night attack on the meadow in advance, for he bore affinity with those red flowers. He took an auspicious page in his hand and drew the face of Khusrau on it. When he had worked on that form a little bit, he went on and hung it hung the portrait on a tree, on the trunk of a tree. And when he vanished from there like a fairy, those fairy-faced ones arrived like fairies. Now, if we take a look at this picture, we see that there are three major characters in this scene. One is Shīrīn, who is surrounded by her companions. The other is King Khusru's boon companion, Shapur, who Nizami introduces as a mouthpiece for his own poetic powers, as well as being in charge of making Shīrīn fall in love with the king. But before we go to the third major character in the scene, let's take a look how Nizami introduces Shapur. چو من نقش قلم را در کشم رنگ کشد مانی قلم در نقش ارژنگ بجنبد شخص که او را من کنم سر ببرد مرغ که او را من کنم پر. When I make a pen drawing and put colors on it, Mani strikes out his pictures in the gallery of Arjang. The person whose head I paint moves, the bird whose wings I paint flies. It's interesting to keep in mind what power he assumes through an artifact. But there is a third character in this scene too. Can anyone guess who that third character is? So we have Shapur, we have Shīrīn and her companions, but there is third major character in this painting.
The one hiding by a tree.
It's the painting itself.
The painting.
It's the painting itself in Shīrīn's hands. It's a painting exuding the psychological force that the power of Shapur's mimesis enables in the heart of unsuspecting Shīrīn. She falls in love with the painting, right? Or through the painting. Shapur, like Nizami, aims to create a certain kind of emotional response or better emotional resonance in the viewer. It is important to note that Nizami emphasizes Shapur's role here as a mediator, whose mimetic devices like painting, he introduces her as a mediator who uses mimetic devices like painting to plant the seed of desire in Shīrīn's heart. However, what's fascinating here is that he not only paints the likeness of Khusrau on paper, but also hangs it in a very strategic place for a specific viewing angle at various intervals. Nizami presents us this curation or this elaborate staging in three long chapters in the poem, which I won't go into at the moment. However, to give you an example of the affect his mimetic efforts aim for, I would like to read some verses from the second chapter of this series, Namudane Surat Khusrau Bari Dohum, and Shapur shows the portrait of Khusrau the second time. And I quote, "When at dawn the ruddy bay horse of the sun cast up fiery dust by its shoes on stone, it opened treasures hidden in every corner, like the ocean every mountain was brocaded." The scene opens. On the one hand, Shapur advanced behind those houri-like beauties and laid the very paper open on which he had made the portrait. On the other side came those heartwarming idols and started playing in the meadows as if flowers. The fine silken shirts of those moon-faced ones were so beautiful that they seemed to mock the moon itself. Happy, their joy started to surface. Gradually, little by little, it began to grow. When those puppets began to play again, time began its own shadow puppetry. As Shapur displays the portrait again, and Shīrīn lays her eyes on it again. When Shīrīn opened her eyes again, she looked at that soulful likeness of King Khusrau. The bird of her soul flew away, and her tongue became close to speech. Eventually, she called her friends and asked, "What's going on here? Am I wrong, or is this really a fantasy?" She told those beech-like cypresses, "Bring that portrait near me quickly." They went to that portrait and brought it to her, who wondered, how can it be possible to hide the sun with the mud? This is Nizami's imagery to say, like now it's inevitable. You can't hide the sun with the mud. It's going to happen. As you can see in these verses, Shapur succeeds in accomplishing the task of making Shīrīn fall in love with Khusrau. However, having witnessed his glamorous ruses of mimetic mediation, one can't help but wonder, is it Khusrau she falls in love with, or the moving portrait Shapur makes of him in a Christ-like fashion? The indeterminacy and ambiguity around this question is worth pondering, as much of what comes of the story between Khusrau and Shīrīn opens up other concentric circles of perspectives that Nizami employs to problematize further the bewitching structure of desire. If with his elaborate staging of mimetically mediated desire, he shows the inherently manipulative nature of courtly speech and visuality, then with Farhad's introduction to the poem, he offers a contrast. Unlike Shīrīn, whose love for Khusrau is orchestrated by highly theatrical mediation, Farhad's love for Shīrīn is born in the depths of unnameable, unknowable, and unrepresentable emotion. And this is just a few verses from the episode where Farhad discovers his own desire for Shīrīn and is completely taken off guard. Doesn't know how to even articulate what happens to her. Ze Shīrīn guftano guftare Shīrīn shude hosh asar Farhad naskeen. Sukhanhara shanidan mi tawanast walekin fahm kardan mi nadanast. Zabanish kard pasuk ra faramusht nehad az ajizi bar dide angusht. From Shīrīn speaking and by her sweet talk, poor Farhad lost his mind. He could hear everything she said, but couldn't understand a thing he said. His tongue forgot to answer. In embarrassment, he hid his eyes with his fingers. When he hears the laughter of Shīrīn from behind the veil, he loses speech and all sense of presence. As opposed to the crafty poetics of courtly love underpinning the story of Khusrau and Shīrīn, Farhad's tragic passion opens up a window into a different kind of love. A passion which is not aware of itself, and its sincerity destroys all certainties of the self-assured subject, leaving nothing for language to articulate. The poem's reception between late 13th and mid-19th centuries in North India is primarily divided between these two perspectives on desire. While much of court-commissioned retellings from Amir Khusrau onward persist in perpetuating the courtly frame of the poem, the vernacular retellings in Urdu, Punjabi, and even in the late 19th century Persian respond to the poem in a highly dynamic display of identification and attunement to its non-courtly stratum. From the filigree of courtly characters dealing with the inherent possibilities of speech and representation, the focus seems to shift entirely on Farhad's silent tragedies in the vernacular retellings of the poem. The gravesite of Shīrīn and Farhad in Las Bela does not carry any inherent value. That is, it does not belong to the past in which these characters are primarily situated. The shrine is a relatively new construction, most likely a late 19th and early 20th century phenomenon. However, for people who consider it as part of Las Bela's sacred geography, the shrine carries an attached value, a form of materialized belief that celebrates as well as mourns the tragedy that resonates from Nizāmī's poem and continues to reverberate through various epochs of literate and oral memory. Could this shrine and the devotional practices around it be part of the poem's reception history? Could this material cultural archive open new ways of approaching the project of literary historiography, one that is not invested in mere formalism and structural atomism of high cultural texts, but aims to engage effective attachments of its readers? In this talk, I briefly address the dual motion of resonance that takes place between reading Nizāmī's poem and responding to its dynamic poetics of openness throughout its reception history. In doing so, I try to show that by engaging the longue durée of poems' afterlife in North India, we can make the project of literary history a more yielding project of the history of emotions. In approaching the reception of Nizāmī's poem in North India, we not only come to witness the poem's afterlife beyond the high cultural poetics of courtly poetry, we also see a thriving sensibility of the past, continually informing and shaping the experience of the present. Thank you.
Excellent presentation, Aqsa.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it, very thought-provoking. And I'm sure we have a lot of questions here from historians of emotions and love. So please, anyone here?
Yeah, first I asked this question, then I have lots of more questions that we can, like maybe I can ask them later on. But the first question is about desire. Like, what framework exactly? Like, what iteration were you using? Was it like in general, Lacanian desire, or?
For me, in this project, I have tried my best to not to succumb to the lure of Western theory of desire, because so much of what gets theorized on the question of desire is supported by these fictional narratives that come to inform a particular cultural sensibility. My project as a history of emotion project is invested in recovering the structures of desire that are informed from within the dense philology of its own time. It's good to compare. It's good to employ Lacan or Derrida or any other psychoanalytic theory. But when you're talking about psychoanalysis, I guess psyches have to be understood as a purpose of text, right? And that those texts are informing a particular understanding of desire for me. So for me, application of theory is not what I'm interested in. For me, the question of theorizing from within is more important.
Okay, like a desire, and it's the fact that it's non-articulated, it's just reminding me of a bit of Lacan still, but because yeah, he says that desire is not enunciated, there's something left. And like the fact that you have the image, and the symbolic order still, I think, still.
Chronologically, you see, Nizami said it before Lacan, so.
The original theorist.
The theorist. I mean, look, as I argued, the poem for Nizami is the site of thinking. It's doing the work of thinking, which we usually associate with the discursive practices of philosophy and other discursive modes of thinking. And that's where I think what becomes available of desire, or what gets articulated of desire, is not about desire as much as its constitutive dimension, like what desire does, what is the affective dimension of it. So I think this is where poetry as a mode is more important. The mimesis, exactly. So it expands the scope, like what speculative philosophy only encompasses summarily, it makes you see it at a much wider scale and a much different.
Thank you.
Very good. Later.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you this question. Thank you so much for your brilliant presentation, first of all.
Thank you.
And as a scholar, because you have been studying like the poems and the illustrations together, I just want to see between the narrated poem and the painting, which both of them are the medium, which one is stronger in terms of the visuality. And if you are agree on the poem, how strong did you find the poetry?
How strong did I find poetry? Look, all these illustrations that you saw, they were commissioned at various points in history. Some of them I used here were from Central Asian codes, the other were from Indian codes, like some of them look from the Mughal period and so on. I think the painting gets inspiration from the poetry, the poetic in this sense. Nizami's language is so descriptive. It's very expressive. You can almost see through his language, or at least see from his language. He can paint a picture, and I think that's what lures people like me to his poetry, or keep struggling with his thing. So I definitely think it inspires, it enables that visual illustration. But of course, I still believe there is something to be said about the mystery that language has in its own right, and visuality that kind of makes everything present, like it's all there. Whereas in the language, you are trying to deal through words and then trying to imagine. It's dual motion, I think, in that regard.
And through this in speculation, I wanted to see if you found, you told me that you found the relation between the poems and the illustrations. So can we say that the power of imagination is a great medium to understand the poetry?
Definitely. I think it enables that medium in you. You see, the question is, if you, let's say, if I'm an atheist of love, say, love doesn't exist and whatever, and Nizami takes this man along and says, I'm going to make her fall in love. You read his poem, and he actually says that in the apologia of his poem, where he actually says, just like Shapur does, that reading my poems will make you fall in love. Because without it, you have a frozen heart and you can't even feel. So it has the constitutive dimension, It not only reflects, but it also shapes the experience of love. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
I want to take a detour with that question and think about the scene that you described, Shapur drawing Khusrau and then Shīrīn falling in love with him. To what extent this is anticipation of photographic consciousness and photography. So in a sense, you are drawing something that is like the original, and then by seeing someone's photo, say, oh my God, I want to meet this person. And you have a situation like that.
Absolutely. I think it precedes the theater of envy that now we have even Instagram and Facebook.
Right. So
It's
the origin of it.
It's amazing. I keep questioning myself, why does he spend so much energy in just showing us how desire is born? He could just say they fell in love. Let's move on. He just doesn't do that. He spends a lot of time in creating that, as you say, the image. And what psychological forces have in creating that interaction between the viewer.
So rather than being face to face, it's face to image and falling in love with the image, and then you want to find the original. The real.
The real. Or in Shireen's case, it's a bit of a disappointment because when she actually meets Khusrau, what a disaster he is.
All right, please.
Yes. So my question is, thank you for your presentation. My question is that how much and in which ways did the long laugh poetry of North India influence the whole reception of Nizami's work in Pakistan or North India? So it's like the long Sanskrit tradition with Megha Sutra and all those laugh poetries. So how much did you focus on this, if you did, or? Yes, and in your work. So what do you think about it?
Look, when you cast that net so wide, it's impossible to say anything definitive. So,
Yeah.
the way when you're writing an academic piece like a dissertation, you're bounded by the conventions of the genre, right? So you have to have the questions there, you have to scope narrow enough, but wide enough that you can address these questions. My dissertation does not look at the Nizami's reception in terms of impact, right? Like
I
that
see.
diverse idea of hermeneutic. It's not I'm not looking intertextuality in different as just forms of referentiality. For me, I'm arguing that, for my dissertation purposes, I'm arguing that it has a hermeneutic function. So when Amir Khusrau retells Nizami's poem, he's in a hermeneutic dialogue with the poem and its questions. Because I'm assuming that Nizami's poem asks a question. There is a question embedded in, right? And once that question is taken up, which I'm arguing is the question of love, right? Then there is a whole transcendental debate or conversation that goes on. So in this regard, it's a hermeneutic dialogue that I'm reconstructing, rather than just saying, oh yeah, well, Jami's use of Zulekha is heavily influenced by Khusrau and Shīrīn, but that's the impact narrative. That's the impact that I'm going to say. For me, it's more how the conversation goes on. What keeps Nizami's poem thriving long after its contextual interpretation of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Ganjavi.
Thank you for your comprehensive presentation on the topic. And I really like the concept of the history of emotion that you propose. But the
A
history
little
of
bit louder, so.
Oh, yeah. But the history of emotion, just like any intellectual history, it might be influenced by the broader social or like political like ongoing history. So I wonder by the 18th century or toward the 19th and 20th century, when the shrine was built, and 18th century when the Hashim Shah he wrote the new version of poetry. So when the idea that the death cannot end love, or the idea that the emotion and the body, the relationship between the emotion and the body kind of change. Do you recognize like any social history on emotion and body, material body outside of poetic literature, like in terms of like maybe like medical development or the way that people understand like body and emotions that might have influenced the authors or the people who are kind of reading those literature, and they have different expectations, right?
Look, it would be great to engage social history in discussing the question of fiction, how it impacts and vice versa. I don't engage a lot of social history because so much of social history, I mean, this would be great to, like, for example, connect it with the medical discourse that we're talking about. I think I lack confidence to do that. But I do think, you know, the larger Sufi narrative around 18th century and also the political history of 18th century of India, very Mughal Empire, the death throes, and you know, everything is like, it's changing world order in a way. And in that particular context, that poem is retold for a particular purpose. And Hashim Shah is very unique in that regard, because Punjabi poets who are writing during in this era of 18th century, rarely they ever picked up a Persian story and retold it. So the phenomenon in 18th century, literary phenomenon in 18th century, is more like creating or finding local stories. So you have stories like Iranian, you know, Soni Mahibal, Mirza Sahibal. These stories might echo some of the Islamic personate modalities of desire and love and emotion, but they do not necessarily are in docile subservience. Hashim Shah in that regard is very unique because he actually picks up a whole story, he retells it, and there's so much of the questions that he engages throughout that story. In 19th century, for example, much of colonial history, in 19th century, for example, British colonialism informs a lot of storytelling in that regard. Munshi Gobind Prasad Fazal, you know, the 5th chapter of my dissertation actually deals with that, who actually retells Nizami's poem as a form of redemptive remembrance, because he actually uses it as a counter-temporality of the positivistic historiography of the British philologists, and provides it as a memory which goes way deeper than, you know, the narratives of the death culture entertain. So a lot is there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the lovely presentation. I wanted actually to borrow some parts from our friend's question about the historical perspective, but I wanted to go a little bit further back to 12th century, really, when this poetry is, you know, being developed. We are talking about a period that it's we see a great conflict, basically. It's a pre-Mongol, post-Islamic, after 4th century, you know, after that, and so many conflicts around. But the word Islamic that you are using, it's maybe I'm mistaken. You are using it in a very mixed way with Persian. In a comparative way, as a researcher, I'm sure you were going back and forth in so many perspectives that you were confronted, especially in a comparative way. As you mentioned, we're talking about vocabularies such as beauties, visual representation, and so many other words that were very sensitive in the Islamic period. So my question for you is, if you could share with us the comparative experience that you had when you were dealing with this Islamic, Persian, or so many other perspectives that at the same time were happening during 12th century when this poetry were done. Because it's a very, very complex cultural issue.
In a sense, if I should intervene to interpret it in a way, would be, can you de-Islamicize love? Is it necessary to always have this grand theological debate in the background of discussing love?
But the question is, why do we think about the Islamic as only theological reference?
Yeah.
Why don't we think of it as a cultural reference? Because just like the Persian modality that we're talking about, like identify with Islam and Persian is different, Islam is different. India has the same narrative. How the hell is India is Islam? Right? So in that regard, when we say Islamic, just because we say Islamic philosophy, we're not necessarily talking about only Muslim philosophers with philosophy, right? It's just like taxonomy that is categorized as Islamic philosophy because the larger imperial control is Islam. So when I talk about these narrative retellings of the Nizāmī's poem in Islamic India, I'm talking about India between 13th century onward, when India is under the Muslim Empire, under the control of the Muslim Empire, right? So for me, the reference is political. It's not theological.
Okay.
It's not philosophical. It's just the best available markers for me. Like what else I would call? Say, okay, I can say Urdu retellings, I can say Ganjavi retellings, I can say Persian retellings. When I say Persian retellings, most people think I'm talking about Iranian retellings, right? But in India, we have a 1,000-year-long history of Persian language and Persian literature, part of which you see in my dissertation coming in. So I am really not sure how to extricate these references because historically they're so muddy, they're so complicated through various forces of history, but also politics, but also perception. How a literary comparatist would theorize Perso-Islamic world.
In a sense, can it be decoupled?
Can it be decoupled? And if we do, what are the limitations? Like we have to know what are the contours. So Islamicate or Persianate in that is that Islamicate is Marshall Hobson's term. It is the plurality of the Islamic world. I as a Muslim from Pakistan would probably not have everything identifiable with the Muslim from Egypt. And yet we are under the same reference of a Muslim resident in the country.
Also Jewish, Armenian.
Yeah. So in that regard, and for Nizāmī, I don't think love is discussed in the religious or the theological.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm arguing that he is doing the opposite. He's pushing the reference outside of the theological and therapeutic philosophical space.
Precisely.
He's giving you something much.
And that's why that question becomes pertinent, because Nizāmī intentionally moves away from the soul, the self, the divine, and creates a different type of storytelling, a different account of love. And then would the decoupling be useful in a sense? That would be the question.
Yeah.
One more thing very quickly.
Yes.
Especially in the case of this poetry that is depicted or brought back from 400 years at least history, into the 12th century from a pre-Islamic. And it's a good example that probably he's trying to revive from a pre-Islamic notion or cultural thing. Just
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about the town of Ganjavi in 12th century, as you know, it's suspended between the Byzantine politics on the one hand and the Sunni Muslim politics of the Turks on the other. And of course, the religious tensions are informed so much of literary action that takes place. In fact, Nizami in his prefatory chapters talks about somebody called Hafiz Damsaz, his Hafiz Damsaz. And his Hafiz Damsaz is more like an inner voice that tells him, why the hell are you telling this pagan story? And he says, and so on. He says, but Shabli Nomani, for example, in 19th century, reads this episode as an instance of an Orthodox Muslim or person telling Nizami, why are you spending time into retelling this pagan story? There is no point in doing that. So that religious tension is very much there, and it's actually in the prefatory chapters of Paul. So, but I don't think Nizami remains restricted to that tension. For him, the aesthetic mold of the storytelling is very important. So I really don't know how much we can pin the poet down to the context. In fact, I'm arguing that I'm more interested in seeing Nizami's poem in terms of what makes it survive after 12th century or post-12th.
Let's entertain one more question from the floor, please. Yes, we have several.
So many questions. Thank you so much for great talk. Opened my eyes to my own take on Nizami. My question is
A little bit louder, so
basically, I wanted to ask you why Khusru and Shīrīn in this particular, because we have Layli and Majnun. There is a love story there, although it's not kingly or royal, and we have Half Baked Cat. Again, we have mimic desire there. There are pictures of why in particular Khusru Shīrīn and draw your interest into the whole aspect of this desire and time. Is there any particular reason that Khusru Shīrīn stands out of all the stories, out of all the all the stories that have been retold and recasted by Nizami Ganjavi?
Yeah. So I take it as a personal question, and I think I should answer it in a personal way.
For sure.
That having grown up in Lahore, Pakistan, to a family where Persian literature was transmitted to me in Urdu. And it was a kind of a heritage that I never experienced in Persian language, but its characters, its archetypes, its sensibility was very much present in my upbringing. When I was growing up, I was very sensitive to the way we phrase our day-to-day language. So in Urdu, to use the word Juyashir Lana was very common in my family. The work was so hard, they demanded to bring in Juyashir. What is Juyashir? And one of my uncles told me that, it comes from Nizami poet. So there was exceptional presence of the poem in the day-to-day discourse without me ever knowing the poem. Right. And of course, when I was accepted to McGill and started my PhD, my first encounter with the poem began in my very intense but very helpful sessions with my co-advisor. And that's when we started talking about poetics, rhetoric, and so on and so forth. And of course, as a graduate student, you have to propose a dissertation topic and so on. That's what is it that I can live with for the next 10 years of my life? And I think Nizami's poem was exactly that.
And Professor Minokian is smiling.
Yes, first professor.
But still, you haven't answered why Khusru Shīrīn rather than Layli or Majnun or Half-Baked Yam.
Majnun has inspired me. Not because Nizami didn't write it well, but because it just never spoke to me. And I think the fact that there was so much ambiguity in Khusru Shīrīn, because many people actually argue that Shīrīn is this very headstrong feminist icon and so on and so forth, but it's not that simple. What really draws me to Nizami's Khusru Shīrīn is that, you see how he masks patriarchy, how he masks misogyny, how he makes certain statements about the question of the feminine subjectivity and then withdraws them. And only in the later retellings you see that those strata are kind of picked up and brought back into conversation.
Okay, Pegah, please.
Hello, thank you very much. It was an interesting talk. You spoke, Aqsa, of several subjects. I need one precision from your side before making one comment and then asking my question. What is the earliest dated Punjabi version of Shirin Farhad that you have found so far? Is it Sayyid Hashim Shah's?
This is Hashim Shah's version that I have found.
Which means late 18th, early 19th centuries.
No, it's late 18th century,
Late 18th century.
Late 18th century.
Okay, very good. So now I move on to my comment before asking my question. Nizami's work dates 12th century, and it was produced in northwest of Iran. Sayyid Hashim Shah's Punjabi version was produced in late 18th century, and in between, many things happened, okay, in Persian and in vernaculars in South Asia. We have several retellings of the story produced particularly in North India, beginning with Amir Khusrau of Delhi at the Khalji court in the 14th century, and then moving on to the 16th century Mughal court. At the court of Akbar, we have Urfi Shirazi, the first person, as far as I know, I have found so far, who makes a shift in the plot of the story, and instead of focusing on the love between Khusrau and Shīrīn, brings on the character of Farhad and changes the name of the narrative to Shīrīn and Farhad. As far as I know, as far as I remember, Nizāmī in his Khusru Shīrīn does not elaborate on the love between Farhad and Shīrīn, while in Urfi's work dating to the 16th century, produced in India, and following that, Vahshi's work in the same century, Farhad or Shīrīn, we see this episode being elaborated. Okay, so this is a product of later Persian poets living in the 16th or 17th centuries onwards. And these narratives do not retell the same things. Okay, they are not narrating the same story. The dynamics of the characters are totally different. For instance, you showed us a picture, a miniature of Khusrau and Shīrīn playing chogan in your presentation. Well, as far as I remember, you have to check that, but as far as I remember, Nizami's work does not have this episode. It is part of this version.
There is a whole section on their playing.
So it is taken from another version, another retelling, okay? On the other hand, the picture that you showed us, the image that you showed us of, Khusrau II's painting is being presented to Shīrīn, the first sequence in which Shīrīn gets to know a bit about the Persian king, Khusrau Parviz. That episode is omitted in Amir Khusrau Dehlavi's version. And in later versions of the story, it is not even found. As far as I have checked so far, in Urfi's, in Vahshi's, in Hatifi's retellings, this episode is not found. So we have to be more precise. Many things have happened between the 12th and 18th centuries. and poets have changed their approach towards this narrative. Why focusing on an episode in Nizami's work, which is not found in South Asian retellings of the story? So my question is, that is related to my question. If you can respond, please. How is love interpreted differently in the Indian literary culture compared to the Persian literary culture? Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you always for your, Tanya and I have known each other a long time. She's been very kind in helping me with the various manuscript versions of the Khusru and Shīrīn when I was preparing my doctoral project. So, Tanya, thank you for everything, what led me to this whole thing. First of all, I would like to say that Amir Khusru's retelling does not take place in 14th century. The date that I have found on Khusru, Shīrīn or Khusru is 1298. So it's the late 13th century retelling. Secondly, I haven't read Urfi Shirazi's retelling, but I would like to. The question of precision that you're talking about, I don't think my project is about finding episodes that Nizami has and later poets don't. I think the question is, I think I'm more interested in understanding the variance of these retellings, like why they change, at which points they change, and of course, I've written a whole dissertation to address that idea of variance. About your question, how love is interpreted, again, the fact that Shīrīn and Farhad episode gets the center stage in the vernacular retellings in North India actually is to explore that different idea of love that does not correspond to the poetry idea of amorous desire. So in my talk, I tried to show some version of how these two polarities of desire come into conversation with each other. So I think we'll have to talk more specifically about retellings in Urdu, in Ganjavi, Sindhi, Saraiki, and Balochi when we are discussing these notions of interpretation of love.
Very good. And now we go to Jahangir, please. Vishal Jahangir.
Hi, yes, I just wrote my question in the chat, but I can say it out loud as well. Given what you, yeah, thank you. Given the notions of emotion and temporality that you discussed, I'm wondering how you find the modern day conception of Khusrau or Shīrīn as different from its early reception, and how you might foresee this evolving.
I guess it depends where you see the reception of, where you see the modern reception of Khusrau and Shīrīn. And to me, I think this category of modern is also very problematic. So much of the narrative of modernity in India is connected with the narrative of colonialism. So I'm not sure if I can answer your question, Vishal, at the moment, but I think Bollywood is one place to look at.
That's awesome.
We have so many retellings of Shīrīn Farhad narratives there. I don't know if I want to address that. Like my classical taste doesn't allow me to sit through those tortures.
Aqsa, we have had a series of questions that have been historical, history, literary historical, and I want to take it into ethnographic, anthropological. You talked about Khusrau Shīrīn Shrine. Are there any descriptions of who comes there? Do lovers come there? Do lovers come there, look at it as mazar-e-ishq or as zadgah-e-ishq? Do they come to celebrate love, or do they come to mourn the loss of love? Any sense, I'm just wondering whether there is enough material to be able to anthropologize and do ethnographic field research of the mazar. What kind of people are coming there?
Las Vegas Balochistan is actually, as I mentioned in my presentation, is quite high on the rates of honor killings. The number of honor killings actually exceeds the number of honor killings in the rest of the world. So 786 honor killings every year, which is a very different number than the rest of the world. A corollary of Nazar Shīrīn Farhad in Las Vegas is Mir-Djalali's Nazar in Punjab. And that is where you see Badistra's very famous heroine, again, a very famous love poem character in the Punjabi language. People come there to pray, to celebrate the love story of Mir-Djalali, tragic love story. And the same is true for Nizar Shīrīn Farhad in Las Vegas. The kind of people who come here are usually, in my experience, I haven't done the extensive field work that needs to be done, but people who come there are primarily people who are young, who find themselves in the event of being in relationship to someone they want to marry, but are doing it under the constant threat of being killed if they're found out.
Mhm.
So in that regard, the shrine is symbolically an emancipatory place. As I've done it.
Speaking intercession.
Intercession, yes, definitely. But then it's also a very, the irony is that it's a very heretical shrine too.
Mm.
Like,
Yep.
my heat is buried on her own there. Like, she's one person in one single grave, but here it is actually believed that they are buried together, despite having buried separately in two different graves. So I think those questions definitely inform my fascination with the shrine. And anthropologizing and ethnographizing is definitely a possibility that can yield more in-depth understanding of the shrine. And hopefully I will end up writing an article with that field work to back up these questions.
It would be a great place to call Lovelandia.
How does the land speak the language of love? I think this is the shrine which gives us
And honor killing.
an honor killing. The contrast, yes.
Yeah. Let's go to Nagar and then to Dr. Mashiri.
So just to clarify it for myself, so what you're saying is Nizami try to stay open about how he's like framing love or interpreting love, and that he is sort of writing for posterity, for the ones who come, who may come, like as we talked about ontologies of the past and temporality, like writing for the future. So just to clarify for myself, is this how you were just leading your argument?
Oh, for the chapter which is the first chapter of my dissertation, I actually argued that Nizami wrote this poem as an open text, which is the Umberto Eco's argument for modern literature being open as opposed to medieval literature being closed. Text.
And
But being open is not the same thing as writing an open text. You see, traditionally, when medieval poems are written, they allow like 2 or 3 possible modes of interpreting the poem. It's analogical, allegorical, and so on. For Nizami, it's very different. Like Khusru Shīrīn is very different. You see, Julie Nizami is somebody, who says Khusru Shīrīn is a casuistry of love. It's like it disturbs, it's just like you don't know what's going on. So that openness is not actually to confuse, it's actually to expand the ways in which love appears in the human realm. Yeah.
Dr. Mashiri.
Question. In terms of, I'm just wondering, in terms of production of manuscripts, which of the books of the Khamsa are produced more, or we have, survived in terms of production? That probably gives us an idea of which one was more popular in terms of not only production, but also spread across the subcontinent. Was it Khusru and Shīrīn, or was it in general, the Khamsa in general, or were they separately produced?
I mean, I'm probably not the best person to talk about the manuscript productions because I don't necessarily work on the circulation of manuscripts as a whole. Look, I mean, Nizami's poems, whether it's Layli or Majnun, Khusru, Shīrīn, as I said, they were very much part of the modern literate culture. But what is fascinating to me is the vernacular reception of these poetries, you know, and I think this is an aspect of Persian poetry's reception that has not been studied enough. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ijaz, for your outstanding presentation. And thank you all. Thank you all online to joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next Friday.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day, everyone. See you later.